February 1945, Essen, Germany. Deep underground in a cellar, a mother presses her two kids tight against a brick wall that keeps trembling like it's alive. It's about 2 o'clock in the morning. The siren started around midnight. The first bombs hit not long after, and now, hours later, the pounding still hasn't stopped. Not scattered, not random. It's steady, measured, like someone is checking boxes. The woman, Frau Greta Hoffmann, doesn't need to run outside to know who's up there because she's learned the pattern the hard way. The Americans usually come in daylight. You can sometimes see the white streaks in the sky. You hear the anti-aircraft guns start up. You watch fighters claw their way upward to intercept. And when the bombs fall, they tend to fall where industry is. Rail yards, factories, oil plants. The parts of a city that scream war machine. That doesn't make it safe. It just makes it readable. If you don't live near those places, you might get through a raid without your neighborhood becoming the target. You can tell yourself, stay away from the big plants, stay away from the yards, and maybe luck stays on your side. But the British? They come at night. And to German civilians like Hoffmann, that difference feels like the difference between an accident and the end of the world. Because British night raids don't feel like they're hunting a factory. They feel like they're hunting the city itself. Homes, apartments, old town streets, hospitals, whole blocks where families are sleeping, not working. And when the attack is built around incendiaries and blast waves working together, what follows isn't just bomb damage, it's a city turning into a furnace. If you've ever wondered why so many Germans described British night bombing as the thing they dreaded most, more than the American raids, this is where it starts. Not with tonnage charts, not with target maps. It starts with what it feels like when you cannot predict what will burn next. Before we go deeper, quick favor, if you like WWII stories that don't skip the ugly parts, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Now rewind. German civilians in the early war years understood one basic idea. Britain would hit back. Germany had already bombed British cities. London, Coventry, and others showed what modern air war looked like. So retaliation wasn't shocking in itself. A lot of Germans expected bombing. Some even thought it was the normal price of war. What they didn't expect was what kind of bombing it would become. Early RAF raids on Germany weren't the apocalypse people later remembered. In 1940 and into 1941, many attacks were limited. Smaller groups, less weight of bombs, plenty of missed targets. German night fighters and flak defenses intercepted bombers, scattered formations, and sometimes turned raids into failures. And German propaganda jumped on that. Movie theater newsreels and radio voices painted a comforting picture. Britain was desperate, Britain was ineffective, and British raids were basically pointless. The message was always the same. Germany was the professional force, striking real military targets, while Britain was lashing out at civilians because it couldn't win a real fight. And, for a while, that story felt believable. Berlin might take a few hits, broken windows, a crater here, a damaged roof there, and the regime could point at it and say, "See, this is all they can do." That false confidence mattered because it shaped how civilians processed what came next. If you think the enemy is weak, you don't prepare your mind for true catastrophe. You treat raids like a nuisance. You go back to bed. You joke about it the next day. Then 1942 arrives, and the tone changes. Not because the Germans suddenly got softer, not because the war suddenly got unfair, but because the RAF's method changes and the scale changes. By 1942, RAF Bomber Command is being driven toward mass night operations that aim to overwhelm defenses, and under Air Marshal Arthur Harris, the focus hardens into something German civilians will experience as systematic urban destruction. The moment that shatters the old assumptions comes in late May. Cologne, May 30th into May 31st, 1942. This isn't a small raid. This is a statement. Over 1,000 aircraft are involved, an enormous concentration by the standards of the time. Instead of a handful of bombers slipping through, the city faces a thick stream designed to saturate German defenses. Pathfinders go in first to mark the aim point, and then the main force follows. The raid lasts around an hour and a half, and when morning comes, the center of Cologne, especially the old medieval core, isn't just damaged. Huge sections are wiped out. Thousands of buildings are destroyed. Tens of thousands of people are suddenly without homes. Hundreds are dead. Those numbers are horrifying, but they still don't fully explain what Cologne does to the German imagination, because the deeper message of Cologne is simple. If Britain can do this to Cologne in one night, then no city is truly safe. Not just the biggest industrial hubs, not just places with obvious factories. Cities with old neighborhoods, cultural centers, historic districts, places people assumed were not the point, are vulnerable too. And that realization spreads fast. In the days after the raid, ordinary Germans describe something like a collective shock. Fires everywhere, emergency crews overwhelmed, water lines broken, streets blocked, families trapped below ground, while the world above turns into burning timber and collapsing stone. The most brutal part from a civilian perspective is the feeling that the bombing isn't shaped around a single factory fence line. It's shaped around the city as a living thing that can be killed. And once German civilians grasp that, a new kind of fear sets in, the kind that doesn't require bombs to be falling right now. Because with night raids, the terror isn't only the impact, it's the waiting. Darkness becomes a countdown clock. You go through your day with a knot in your stomach because you know what the night might bring. Sirens might wail, they might not. Bombs might fall in your district, or across town, or not at all. But you still lose sleep because your brain can't relax. And that uncertainty is poison. American daylight raids, for all their danger, often feel to civilians like something you can at least frame in your head. You can sometimes guess where they'll aim. You can tell yourself there's a logic. Hit production, hit rail, hit oil. British night raids feel like the opposite. A heavy hand reaching into the city and crushing whatever it grabs. Cologne is the warning shot, the proof of concept. The moment people realize the earlier raids weren't the whole story, they were the warm-up. And now Germany is about to learn what happens when that method is applied again, and again, and again, until entire cities start to vanish into fire. Because if Cologne is the shock, the next phase is the lesson. And the lesson has a name that German survivors will never forget: Hamburg. After Cologne, German civilians stop thinking in terms of raids. They start thinking in terms of the next night, because the RAF isn't just striking one city to make a point. They're building a rhythm. Darkness, sirens, EU engines, impact, fire, then the long, stunned morning after. And the worst part isn't always the night it happens. It's the nights when nothing happens. People sit in their apartments, staring at the clock, listening for the first warning. They jump at every distant thump. They lie to their kids, saying the flak is far away, even when it's not. They keep shoes by the bed, because if the siren hits, you don't want to waste 10 seconds looking for them. That's what this campaign does. It turns everyday life into a waiting room for disaster. Diaries from the period show how the mind starts to crack under that pressure. One night, the sirens go off and nothing falls, so everyone spends hours underground anyway. Another night, the sirens come late and people run half awake downstairs carrying blankets and bread like it matters. Then, finally, the bombs actually come, and some people feel a sick kind of relief because at least the suspense is over. That's the special terror of night bombing: uncertainty plus inevitability. You know it's coming. You just don't know when your street gets picked. Now here's the twist. While all that fear is spreading, another bombing campaign is growing, one that looks and feels totally different. Because the Americans arrive in force in daylight, the U.S. 8th Air Force starts hitting Germany in big formations, in broad daylight, flying heavy bombers that look like moving steel blocks in the sky, B-17 flying fortresses, and B-24 Liberators. They fly tight, disciplined groups, stacking guns and firepower together so they can defend themselves, and they aim at specific targets: ball-bearing plants, rail yards, oil refineries, aircraft factories, port facilities, key parts of the German war machine. That's the theory anyway. In practice, bombs still miss, civilians still die, neighborhoods still get clipped by blasts they weren't meant to catch. But German civilians notice the difference fast. Day raids feel like something you can almost map. If you work near the big plant, you're in danger. If your home is far from it, you might be safer. You can tell yourself there's a logic to it, even if the logic doesn't always protect you. Night raids feel like the whole city is in the crosshairs, And German civilians describe that gap in plain terms. The Americans want to break production. The British want the city to burn. That belief, whether perfectly fair or not, becomes the way millions of people process what's happening to them. It also shapes how Germany reacts. American raids can be answered in ways that make sense on paper. If a factory gets hit, you disperse production. You move parts of it underground. You rebuild fast. You reroute labor. You patch rail lines. You work around the damage. The system bends, but it can keep moving. Even the defenses look different. During daylight raids, German fighters go up hard. Fast, aggressive intercepts. Whole air battles explode across the sky. Civilians can literally see it. Fighters streaking toward bomber streams, flak bursting in black puffs, bombers dropping out of formation. It creates a feeling, sometimes false, sometimes real, that the raid is being fought, and the Americans pay a brutal price for that daylight choice. By 1943, U.S. Bomber losses get so bad that some missions look like they're bleeding out. When the Americans strike heavily defended targets like the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, losses can hit shocking levels. Dozens of bombers gone in a single operation. Hundreds of airmen killed, captured, or wounded. Those are numbers that can break an air force if they keep happening. So from the German workers' perspective, the daylight raids are terrifying. But they're also contested. There's a battle happening up there. There's a chance, again, sometimes real, sometimes not, that defenses might blunt the attack. Night bombing doesn't offer that psychological comfort. At night, people don't watch a dogfight. They listen to a deep, rolling drone overhead, and they wait for their building to shake. And the RAF's night method is built to turn that fear into destruction. Not just a bomb hits a roof. It's layered, fires ignited across districts, then blasts that collapse structures, break water mains, and trap fire crews. When fire spreads faster than response, the city becomes its own weapon against itself, so Germany can't adapt in the same way. You can disperse a factory, you can't disperse a neighborhood. You can rebuild a machine shop. You can't quickly rebuild a whole city center where tens of thousands of workers live. And once you've trained people to expect the night to bring fire, morale doesn't just drop, it rots from the inside. Civil defense authorities see this clearly in their own reports. After major raids, civilians don't want to return. Workers try to flee to rural areas. Families break apart through evacuations. Cities lose the human glue that makes factories run at full speed. This is where the British campaign hits a target you can't measure with tonnage. The will to keep living the same life. And then comes the event that brands itself into German memory like a scar. Hamburg, July 1943. The name Germans will attach to it later is simple. A firestorm. Over several raids in a short span, the RAF drops a huge mix of high explosives and incendiaries in patterns designed to maximize destruction. The goal isn't just to damage buildings, it's to create so many simultaneous fires that they merge into something bigger than any one blaze. And that's exactly what happens. Fire feeds fire until the heat becomes its own engine. Winds roar through streets, pulling oxygen toward the center. People in shelters run out of air. People outside can't breathe without inhaling heat and smoke. Asphalt can soften. Wooden beams ignite like kindling. Whole blocks become one continuous burn. Hamburg turns into a place where normal rules stop working. The death toll is enormous. Tens of thousands of civilians killed in a short period. The city isn't merely hit. Huge areas are erased as living neighborhoods. And for German civilians, especially those who survive it, the meaning is unmistakable. This is not a strike on a factory. This is a strike on life itself. Here's another key detail that deepens the contrast. American commanders publicly distance themselves from this kind of bombing. U.S. doctrine is built around daylight precision attacks, and even when that precision fails in practice, the stated goal stays the same. Industrial and military targets. American crews often insist they're trying to hit specific sites, that they don't want to bomb residential districts on purpose, and that they only drop when they can identify the target area. Again, bombs still kill civilians. No one living under a bomber stream is safe. But to German civilians, the intent matters because it shapes how predictable the threat feels. If you live in Bremen and the Americans are coming, you ask, are they aiming at the docks, the shipyards, the aircraft plants? You try to guess where to shelter based on that. If the British are coming at night, you don't guess. You run, because the safe zone might not exist. And now, after Hamburg, fear levels change across the Reich. Cologne proved the RAF could smash a city. Hamburg proves the RAF can make a city disappear into fire. Once that is understood, night itself becomes a kind of enemy. People don't just fear bombs. They fear bedtime. They fear the sky going black. They fear the moment the siren starts because it means the nightmare is no longer theoretical. And that's why, even as American daylight raids become more damaging to production over time, German civilians often keep one belief locked in their bones. The day is dangerous, but the night is monstrous. And in the next phase of the war, that gap will only widen because German leadership has to choose what to protect, what to sacrifice, and what kind of collapse they fear more. Factories failing or cities losing the will to function at all. That choice doesn't stay abstract for long. It becomes visible in where defenses go and where they don't. And by 1944 and early 1945, German civilians will understand exactly what their leaders prioritized while the night keeps coming. By 1944, the difference between day and night isn't just something civilians feel, it's something they can see in the sky. In daylight, American formations come in big, obvious streams. You hear the engines, then the flak starts hammering. German fighters climb fast and hit hard because these daylight raids threaten the parts of the war machine Germany can't afford to lose: oil, aircraft production, rail hubs, ball bearings, refineries. So the Luftwaffe throws its best at the Americans during the day. And that creates a weird kind of comfort for civilians watching from windows and rooftops. Not safety, never safety, but the sense that someone is fighting back, that the raid is being contested, that a bomber might get shot down before it reaches the target. It's a visible struggle, and people cling to that. At night, that feeling is weaker. Night fighting is harder, more technical, more limited. Radar-equipped night fighters exist, and there are skilled aces, but the game favors the attackers. Darkness hides the bomber stream. Electronic countermeasures evolve. The RAF shifts routes, timing, and methods. Even when bombers are shot down, enough get through. So for a civilian on the ground, the night feels like this. A distant droning grows into a ceiling of engines. Then the first impacts, then the fires. And no matter how brave the pilots are up there, the city still burns. That perception matters because morale runs on perception. People don't calculate kill ratios in a cellar. They remember what happens to their street. And this is where German propaganda steps in with a message that almost writes itself. The regime tries to paint American bombing as military and British bombing as criminal. They push images of children, ruined homes, burned neighborhoods. They circulate outrage about night raids. They amplify any American criticism of area bombing they can find. It's cynical, of course. Germany started the war bombing cities, and German forces committed crimes on a scale propaganda can't erase. But propaganda works best when it contains a piece of truth that people already recognize. And German civilians do recognize it. They've watched American bombs hit factories and rail yards. They've also watched British raids turn residential blocks into fire. So the propaganda lands not because it's morally clean, but because it matches lived experience. Behind the scenes, German leadership is wrestling with a brutal question. Which threat is worse, industrial damage or psychological collapse? American raids can degrade production over time, especially once the U.S. gets better at targeting the right systems, like fuel. But Germany can sometimes patch around specific damage. Disperse production, move equipment, rebuild lines, throw forced labor into repairs, shift output between plants. Night area bombing is different. It shreds the places where people live, sleep, learn, recover, and raise kids. It wrecks urban infrastructure. It knocks out water, power, transport, administration. And it creates refugees, waves of people who can't or won't stay in a city that might get turned into a furnace again. You can't relocate 1 million frightened civilians without consequences. And when workers lose families, homes, or any sense of safety, productivity doesn't just dip, it fractures. This is where Albert Speer, the armaments minister, becomes important, not because he's sympathetic, but because he's staring at the system like an engineer. Reports pile up, damage summaries, labor shifts, production figures, civil defense notes about morale. Speer's basic insight is ugly but practical. Germany can fight around some factory damage, but it can't easily fight around a society that's unraveling. He understands that morale and urban function are part of the war machine too, in internal communications. That idea shows up as a recommendation that sounds simple and is politically explosive. Defending cities against night raids should matter more, even if it means factories take more hits in daylight. But Hitler's priorities are different. Whether it's ideology, stubbornness, or a cold belief that production numbers matter more than civilian fear, the leadership keeps leaning toward protecting industrial output. The state is built to value war production over civilian comfort, and the regime assumes it can control morale through force and propaganda. Civilians notice. They may not read Speer's memos, but they see what gets protected and what gets sacrificed. They watch their homes burn while the system demands they keep working. Over time, that corrodes trust, even among people who don't openly resist. And then, in early 1945, the war is already lost on the ground, but the bombing message continues because it's about more than winning battles. It's about proving helplessness. Dresden becomes the symbol because Dresden feels different from the cities already smashed by years of raids. It's famous, cultural, and for much of the war, it's less heavily bombed than other major targets. By February 1945, it's also crowded with refugees moving away from the advancing Soviets. Then, the RAF hits it with major night attacks that create the same kind of mass destruction associated with the late war area bombing campaign. The death toll is horrific, and while exact numbers have been debated and abused by propaganda for decades, the reality remains. Tens of thousands of civilians die in a short window, and a city center is devastated. And the psychological point lands like a hammer. Even now, even at the end, nowhere is safe. After the RAF raids, American bombers strike Dresden in daylight with a different focus, aiming at transportation and rail infrastructure. That doesn't make the overall event clean, and civilians still die. But to German observers, it reinforces the contrast they've been living with for years. The Americans are trying to hit systems. The British are trying to erase the city. By this point, German civilians don't need propaganda to tell them what to fear. They've learned it from Cologne, from Hamburg, from Essen, from the long list of places that have burned. So what happens after the war when people step back and try to measure results? Here's the hard truth. The campaign that felt more tolerable to many German civilians, the American daylight effort, ends up being deeply effective at breaking critical parts of Germany's ability to keep fighting. Fuel, aircraft production, transport links, and key industrial nodes take serious hits, especially as the Allies tighten target selection and Germany's defenses weaken. But the campaign that felt more terrifying, the British night area bombing, does not achieve the clean outcome its strongest defenders sometimes claimed. It inflicts enormous suffering and destroys huge areas of housing and cultural heritage, yet it doesn't reliably break German morale into surrender on its own. The state keeps controlling society. The army keeps fighting. Production, unbelievably, limps along for longer than many people would assume. That's the paradox German survivors often describe later, even if they don't use that word. The bombing that scared them the most wasn't necessarily the bombing that did the most direct, measurable damage to Germany's capacity to wage war. And the bombing that many civilians could mentally categorize as warfare came with a brutal price paid by the people flying those missions. American bomber crews suffer staggering losses in daylight, shot down by fighters, torn apart by flak, destroyed over targets they had to approach in straight lines to aim properly. Those crews are exposed, visible, and hunted. RAF crews in night operations face danger too, but darkness changes the math. It reduces visibility for defenders. It can lower loss rates compared to daylight attacks against heavily defended targets, especially as tactics and technology evolve. So German civilians end up fearing the enemy that feels more unpredictable and indiscriminate, even though the precision enemy often bleeds more to execute its strategy. That doesn't make either campaign gentle. It doesn't make the suffering smaller. It just explains the psychology, because civilians don't judge air war by doctrine manuals. They judge it by what wakes them up, what burns their street, and what takes their family. In daylight, a German civilian might tell themselves, if I'm not near the target, maybe I'll live. At night, they learn to think, it doesn't matter where I live. My turn could come anyway. That belief is a weapon. Not a weapon measured in tons of explosives, but in hours of sleep lost, nerves frayed, children trembling, and cities turning into places people no longer recognize as home. And that's why the darkness becomes the deadliest tool. Not because night bombs are magically stronger, but because night hides intention. It hides the why. And when you can't see the why, you can't predict the where. Sometimes the most frightening enemy isn't the one with the biggest force. It's the one that feels impossible to read. Sometimes terror does more psychological damage than precision, even when precision does more strategic damage in the long run. And for German civilians caught under both campaigns, the lesson hardens into something simple. The Americans came with daylight and targets. The British came with darkness and uncertainty. One could be resisted and explained. The other had to be endured, because at night, you couldn't bargain with logic. You could only listen for sirens, go down into the cellar, and hope, without any real reason, that this time the fire would land somewhere else.